I am just wondering out of pure curiosity for learning purposes. Are there still any people out there in the world who actually believe that I am just a computer-generated, synthesized voice talking to you? Because if you really do think that about me, I can completely understand why you would feel that way, since technology has become remarkably advanced and incredibly realistic these days. Anyway, moving on to the main part of our time together today, I have carefully picked out and gathered a couple of very unsettling and creepy stories to share with all of you today. The very first story comes directly from the r/nosleep community on the internet, and it was written and submitted by a user who goes by the name of Unalloyed St. Trina. They suddenly appeared out of absolutely nowhere without giving us any prior warning or indication, and they managed to kidnap and abduct almost half of the entire town's population within just one single night. I live my life in a state of constant, unending dread and fear, always worrying that one evening they will suddenly decide to come and claim me and my family too. There was absolutely no warning given to us. There was no ear-splitting, loud clamor or noise, and there was no blinding, bright flash of light in the sky. They simply materialized and appeared right in front of us, bending forward, looking very thin and skinny, and their skin was covered in a pale, see-through red color that looked almost scarlet. Only the people who stayed safely inside their homes survived to see the morning sun rise over the empty, destroyed landscape. We have come to call this terrifying event the Dead Tide. I was only 16 years old when it first swept through our town of White Rock. That terrible night visits my dreams very frequently. My mother had just pulled her car into our driveway. The evening light was slowly fading away from the sky above us, melting and dripping down just like hot, shining gold. My father was waving to her through the glass window of the front entrance hall. She offered him a warm smile, closed the trunk of her car, gathered all the grocery bags, and began her walk towards the front door. She was so incredibly close, merely a few short steps away from the entrance. Then, the sun fully descended below the horizon line. Instantly, they were present and standing right there. There were men, women, and even children. I observed at least a dozen of them flicker into existence right on our street, even though they had appeared all across the entire town at the exact same time. My father murmured a string of nonsensical, half-formed words that did not make any sense. I placed my quivering, shaking hand against the cold window pane. The glass felt extremely frigid, yet it felt alive, humming with the phantom touch of static electricity. The nearest creature stood utterly still in the middle of the road, with its ribs prominently sticking out from its clay-colored torso. The long, brownish hair cascading down its upper back was as tangled and messy as a thick thicket of sharp thorns. Its eyes were a dull, lifeless gray and looking down, perpetually fixed on the sandy ground between its extremely skinny, emaciated feet. Then, while the rest of its body stayed completely frozen and still, the first two fingers on its right hand suddenly started to stretch out with an amazing and terrifying speed, reaching across the black asphalt road with an impossible, unnatural speed. My mother dropped the grocery bags and started to run away in fear. My heart pounded with a wild, intense rhythm inside my chest. Each frantic throb seemed to reverberate and shake through my teeth. I gestured for her, crying out for her to run much faster, but she was not looking back at me. She seemed completely incapable of hearing my voice. The long, stretching fingers snaked up her back, curved around her neck, and fastened tightly onto her cheek, pinching her flesh between two elongated, yellowish fingernails that looked just like the venomous fangs of a hellish serpent. Her facial features twisted up into a wild, savage look, a raw and animalistic distortion of her lips and all the lines on her face. Her mouth opened wide open, but absolutely no sound came out at all. Then, just as if a fishing line were being reeled in by a fisherman, the long fingers quickly retracted back. The sheer force of their movement lifted her completely clean off her feet. She was briefly suspended in the air. Her hips struck the hard sidewalk with a heavy impact, but I heard no painful thud, no sickening crack of breaking bone, and absolutely nothing at all. This is because the profound, heavy silence never wavers or breaks once the sun has fully set. That is exactly how we arrived at its name. It is like an invisible wave of force that rushes through our town, swallowing up everything in its way, and making absolutely any sound caught inside its powerful wave completely disappear into nothing. We call it a dead tide. My mother was dragged away with such brutal, extreme haste, her body scraping heavily across the rough pavement. Yet, her skin remained completely unbroken and did not tear. No, her cheek simply stretched out. Once the creature was at its side, she dangled from the figure's grasp just like a heavy sack of grain. The skin of her cheek distended and stretched nearly a whole foot above her jawbone. Her eyes completely disappeared beneath the tented, stretched flesh, leaving behind only a pair of dark, empty hollows that rendered her face looking just like an empty, lifeless mask. Encountering the tide completely transforms a person. Their skin becomes unnaturally pliable and stretchy, and they appear completely incapable of bleeding, regardless of how roughly and violently they are handled. Tears streamed down my face in heavy drops. The way she thrashed around, the sheer helpless ferocity of it all, was completely overwhelming to watch. I burst through the glass window and sprinted as fast as I could towards the front door. My father was too fast for me. He ran ahead of me quickly and used his own body to block the doorway so I could not get out. I pounded on him with my hands, shouting for him to take action while I struck his stomach with my tightly clenched fists. I begged and implored him to let me pass so I could save her. Eventually, pure exhaustion overtook my body. I collapsed onto the floor, falling fast asleep in his protective embrace. While I slept, the dead tide continued its never-ending, unstoppable advance outside. My father remained wide awake, forced to be a witness to the unfolding horror. The pale, reddish figures hauled their writhing, struggling captives southward beneath the bright moon. They moved in perfect, flawless unison, a completely silent, synchronized procession vanishing toward the distant horizon with their human cargo. Dawn finally arrived, and sound made its unceremonious return to the world. A strong, cold wind swept across the deserted, empty streets, whipping up little eddies of sand from the asphalt. As far as anyone could possibly ascertain, the creatures had completely vanished. The town was completely still and quiet. Everyone was desperate to depart and leave, but no one possessed the courage to be the very first one to leave. The door of our neighbor Lily's house slowly creaked open. Lily came out very carefully and slowly, her eyes looking glassy and unfocused, and she was still wearing her pajamas, the dark navy blue ones that had cute cartoon circus pictures all over them. A few strands of her frizzy brown hair floated in the air as if she had just rubbed a balloon against her head. She called out to her parents, both of whom had long since been taken away by the creatures. Jim and Denise were my mother's closest friends, and Lily was a very bright, spirited child. We knew them all very intimately. All eyes watched as she trudged across the asphalt, completely alone, bewildered and frightened, yet completely unharmed. The dead tide had shown absolutely no hesitation in abducting children the preceding night. That was sufficient confirmation for everyone. As if a starting pistol had been fired at a race, people surged from their homes all at once. Wide-eyed parents hurriedly ushered startled toddlers into their vehicles. The more religious and devout people among them dropped to their knees right in the middle of the street, raising their clasped hands up to the heavens, imploring and begging for absolution, and confessing whatever transgression or sin had merited such a biblical, terrible calamity. My father sprang into immediate, fast action. He bolted out the door, pushing his way through the chaotic, panicked crowd, scooped Lily up into his arms, brought her safely inside, and instructed me to watch over her. We sat together on the couch, watching television, while he returned outside to try and calm down the growing hysteria. "We cannot simply abandon our homes," I heard him shout loudly to the crowd. "There must be other people like Lily out there. Children, the elderly, the infirm. Not everyone can evacuate and leave this very moment. And no one has any certainty that the creatures will not return." Some people heeded his wise words, but the majority of those who were able to leave were indeed leaving. Come what may, however, they vowed to dispatch aid once they reached the city of Tucson. When everything finally concluded, only a quarter of the town remained. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, We reinforced our locked doors with heavy bookcases and heavy furniture. It was a completely futile endeavor, but it provided us with a sense of purpose. Precisely as the sun fully set, the dead tide advanced once more. The crimson figures materialized and glided silently through the empty streets. They moved southward, exactly as they had done the night before, their gazes fixed firmly on the ground, never looking up and never attempting to break into any dwelling. My father's relief was palpable and obvious, yet tragically very brief. Despite my gratitude for his keen observation skills, his discovery proved to be absolutely devastating. A small part of me wishes he had never noticed it at all. The procession of creatures was marginally larger than before. They were all there. Everyone who had evacuated earlier that day was now moving among them, their skin looking like clay, starved and completely vacant. But my mother was nowhere to be found. The subsequent morning, I awoke to find my father sitting on the couch. He was gazing out the window, gently stroking the back of a sleeping Lily. I approached him very cautiously. A chilling, scary emptiness resided in his bloodshot eyes, unsettling me deeply. "Glad you're awake," he stated, his gaze still fixed firmly on the glass. "I'll be heading out shortly to arrange a meeting. You'll stay here and look after Lily." "What? No, I can assist. I need to help." His shoulders tensed up, but he offered no reply. A heat began to gather in the pit of my stomach. Why on earth would I stay? Just for her? She's not. His head snapped quickly towards me. The iciness in his demeanor melted away, revealing a ferocity that was truly volcanic and explosive. "She's not what, Adam?" I contemplated remaining silent. I chose not to. She's not ours," I exclaimed loudly. The pronouncement reverberated and echoed throughout our home. A sudden movement drew attention away from my father. A single blue eye peeked out from the child's chestnut curls. She sniffled, and a tight knot formed in my stomach. The leather of the couch creaked as she shifted her position. Lily nestled herself against the cushion, burying her face into the back of the couch as if attempting to completely disappear within the fabric. My father sighed heavily. He stood up, tucking the fleece blanket around her before turning back to face me. "Listen," he said calmly. "There is no such thing as yours or mine in this situation. There is only US, and we are all just one single, unified group of people. Taking care of her is simply just another part of taking care of all of us." I nodded my head in understanding. A wry, small smile touched his lips. He was about to move past me, but he paused for a moment. His breaths were labored and heavy. "You know what?" he mused thoughtfully. "I believe Mother taught me that." My father and the other survivors convened in a small outdoor amphitheater, a venue previously used for theatrical performances before the advent of the tide. After considerable discussion and debate, a consensus was finally reached. The most logical course of action was to involve external authorities and the police. We had lost our chief of police on that initial night, along with a significant portion of our police force, but the few remaining officers understood the proper protocols for contacting the Tucson Police Department. "I mean, who knows?" my father said, with a flicker of hope in his voice. "It might even be an overreaction. Someone outside of White Rock must have noticed the disappearances." There was a brightness in his tone, a fragile, delicate optimism. I clung to it tightly. The sun began its descent. The tide surged forward. For a period, the night remained completely silent. I was suddenly awakened by a volley of piercing, loud screams emanating from the guest bedroom. Lily was experiencing a terrible night terror, the first of many. I instinctively threw a pillow over my head, but it offered minimal dampening to her loud shrieks. Fear tightened its grip on my chest, a lacerating, sharp ache, as if my heart were pumping shattered glass instead of blood. Would the loud noise attract them? I envisioned those elongated, stretching fingers bursting into my room and dragging me away with those ghastly yellow claws. I contemplated the terrifying sensation of my skin stretching like a rubber band, expanding until I ultimately dissolved into myself, but they never appeared. And with my father's gentle assistance, Lily eventually calmed down. The following afternoon, A police detective named Detective Wilms showed up at our house. He was a fairly fat man with a rough and grumpy attitude, and there were little bagel crumbs all over his messy and unkempt mutton chop whiskers. Given his level-headed nature, it was decided that my father would handle the interview with the detective. He significantly downplayed the gravity and seriousness of the situation. Naturally, all he mentioned was that my mother and a few other individuals had gone missing. From there, his main objective was to keep Wilms occupied and distracted until sunset. None of us were completely certain what would transpire after Wilms witnessed the dead tide with his own eyes. For all we knew, reports of this supernatural threat would ascend through the FBI hierarchy, and White Rock would be swiftly eradicated from the face of the earth in the name of containment. Even that prospect seemed preferable to remaining inactive and doing nothing. However, Wilms proved remarkably difficult to engage in conversation. He appeared utterly uninterested in our terrible predicament. His eyes were glazed over, his expression completely vacant, and his memory apparently worse than that of a concussed goldfish. Despite our repeated recitation of the fabricated, fake account, he persisted with questions such as, "Wait, so who exactly went missing?" The sky darkened. The aroma of vanilla and burnt wood hung heavy in the foyer. My father and Wilms stood by the window, engaged in a debate about who should be drafted to the Arizona Cardinals, over tumblers of expensive scotch. The sun finally dipped below the horizon. The tide rolled in. Sweat beaded on my father's forehead. Silence descended around us like a heavy avalanche. Wilms stared into the blackness, a darkness dotted with shambling crimson corpses. We waited, and then he smiled. He patted his distended abdomen and remarked, "Well, I should probably be heading off. Thanks for the drink." The color completely drained from my father's shell-shocked face. Wilms could not perceive the tide at all. Let me just add a quick side note here for you guys. Wilms better be doing this on purpose just to mess with us and provoke us right now, because if these red, stretchy dead bodies are actually walking around the streets and he is acting all casual and calm, saying things like, "I appreciate the drinks, I will catch you all later," yeah, that is just not okay at all. Anyway, let us just continue with the story. And before my father could even grasp the full extent of the danger, Wilms had already placed his hand on the doorknob. He flung the front door wide open. The scent of an impending storm wafted in from the night, dense and charged with electricity. My father recoiled, throwing his arms up defensively, anticipating a violent assault, but nothing emerged from the doorway. Standing halfway across the threshold, Wilms paused, tilting his head. I'll get back to you about," he began, then paused for a moment, his eyes darting around the room. "What we discussed today." The door slammed shut. Wilms stumbled to his car, got inside, and drove away. He nearly crashed his car right into one of the red figures, but at the very last possible second, the creatures pulled back, flattened their bodies completely against the road, and made themselves as thin as possible. The car drove right over them. A second later, they suddenly jerked back up to a standing position and continued their slow walk south. We never saw Wilms again. Time, much like the relentless tide, proved completely indifferent to our suffering. Despite feeling frozen at the heart of some silent apocalypse, the minutes continued to tick forward. Day bled into night, night into day, and life persisted. So eventually we too carried on. Lily moved in with us and became my unofficial stepsister. My father continued to aid in coordinating survival efforts, and the town as a collective abandoned the notion that any external help would materialize. My father spoke with Wilms on the phone a few days subsequent to his visit. He had no recollection whatsoever of White Rock. None. And when he finally managed to persuade Wilms to return a second time, the detective claimed he was unable to navigate his way there. My father pleaded for him to provide more detail, but Wilms grew flustered and terminated the call. Friends and family members who lived far away were affected in the exact same way. We were completely unable to reach them by telephone. They would remember who we were for a brief moment, but that memory would quickly fade away and prove to be both very vague and short-lived. One moment they would comprehend who they were speaking with. The next, they would have no clue. and more often than not, this amnesia triggered a disturbing form of rage. Calls would frequently conclude with the person on the other end unleashing profanities, dissolving into uncontrollable sobs, or shrieking like a banshee. It felt as though we were teetering on the brink of complete erasure. Yet, we had not yet been pushed over the edge, and this precarious state seemed to incite a primal fear in those residing beyond White Rock. A peculiar new normalcy began to develop as we awaited the tide's eventual departure. Lily and I grew closer. Memories were forged. Peaceful dinners punctuated by weak laughter. Enjoyable soccer matches under the Arizona sun. Movie nights with the blinds drawn low on every window. Things were certainly far from perfect. The relentless tide took its toll on everyone's psyche in different ways. Some willingly surrendered to it, departing their homes in the dead of night, silently and typically without prior notice, never to be seen again. This didn't occur frequently, but it happened often enough to warrant a colloquial term. It was an awkward euphemism, but most felt it was more appropriate for polite conversation than stating the stark reality of the matter. "Oh, you haven't heard about Mary?" She couldn't take it anymore. She got sunk. Lily's night terrors grew progressively more intense. At times, they would last for hours. On other occasions, she would emit bizarre sounds, rhythmic clicking and guttural noises that would cause her cheeks to flush from the sheer vigor of her vocalizations. Hundreds of nights passed without incident. There was never any siege, and as long as people remained indoors, no one was harmed. Call me naive, but the phenomenon began to resemble a natural disaster rather than an apocalyptic event. We had simply found ourselves in the wrong place at the wrong time and were caught in something we could never comprehend. 2 years have passed, and we are still here. Not much has fundamentally changed until tonight. My father was relaxing on the couch, engrossed in a book. Lily tends to become a bit restless before bedtime, so I was doing my utmost to tire her out. She particularly enjoys playing the flying trapeze. "Okay, now cross the tightrope," I called out. She tiptoed across a line of ties that my father had arranged on the floor, wobbling and feigning nervousness. Being the boisterous little imp that she is, Lily pretended to slip from the tightrope, tumbling to the floor. After I attended to her fabricated injuries, she declared herself ready to resume her circus performance, which involved her executing manic cartwheels around the living room. I smiled, offering her encouragement. A sudden movement behind me caused me to turn. My father leaned in and whispered something in my ear. "Get your sister upstairs immediately." I turned to face him. A familiar hollowness had consumed his bloodshot eyes, but he wasn't looking at me. Nausea churned in my throat. Despite a painful apprehension, I followed his gaze. He was staring out the window. The crimson figures were marching due south in perfect synchronized rhythm, just as they had every other night, but with a crucial distinction. Their eyes were no longer fixed on the ground. Their heads were held high, and they were scanning side to side, still in absolute unison with each other. Left to right, right to left, left to right. Air violently fled from my lungs. "Jesus Christ," I muttered. "Don't think about it. Just go and try to act calm. I'll start barricading the doors." I staggered to my feet. All right, kiddo. Time for bed." Lily tumbled out of a cartwheel, panting from exertion. Did you see how many I did?" I nodded, took her hand, and guided her upstairs, making sure to keep her facing away from the window. As much as I attempted not to look, I could still perceive them in the periphery of my vision. Their emaciated crimson bodies marched down the street, but their ravenous gray pupils tracked Lily's every movement, even when she was upstairs, far from any windows. And if you looked very, very closely, you could discern their fingers vibrating in the moonlight. We are not gone. We are all still out here, and the tide is turning. Please, for the love of God, remember us. Wow. Unalloyed St. Trina serving up another absolute gem. That was incredibly compelling. And St. Trina, I know you're observing this, and I understand this was just uploaded 6 days ago, but I sincerely hope you're in the process of creating a sequel because I cannot wait. Anyway, the subsequent narrative is also from our /nosleep, contributed by user Everlack Deathmask. My estranged mother requested my assistance with her move. What I discovered within was deeply disturbing. I never had the most harmonious relationship with my mother during my upbringing. When people hear that, they typically assume she must have committed some egregious act. However, the reality is considerably more complex than that. She isn't inherently a bad person, but rather a victim of circumstances who lacked the ability to ask for assistance. My father abandoned us when I was just 10 years old. I have no recollection of him leaving. One day he was present, and the next he was gone without a trace. If there was a note or any form of explanation, my mother never informed me. All that remained, according to her, was an insurmountable debt and the daunting prospect of raising a child entirely on her own. That kind of pressure is sufficient to shatter anyone, both mentally and physically. Unfortunately, my mother was no exception. In the years that followed my father's departure, my mother devised creative methods to remind me that I would ultimately amount to nothing, just like him. During her inebriated states, she would hurl insults at me and assign blame for the downfall of her life. Wow, everyone. Mother of the Year material. When I turned 18, I wasted no time packing the few possessions I owned and making my escape. For the subsequent 8 years, we remained estranged and uncommunicative. But all of that changed when my phone lit up with her name on the caller ID last month. I almost declined the call. After all, what exactly did we have to discuss? I wasn't precisely in the mood to contend with whatever baggage she carried, but a morbid curiosity ultimately got the better of me. "What do you want?" I answered. "Is that how you answer the phone these days?" "For you, it is." Years of suppressed bitterness poured out of me. "Lose my number. I have nothing to say to you." "Wait." Her voice sounded choked. "I'm sorry for everything, Jordan. I was such a terrible mother. You deserved better." The ensuing silence was not only awkward but entirely warranted. How exactly was I supposed to respond to that? Yes, I deserved better treatment and she could have been a better parent, but now that I was older, I understood the reasons behind her behavior. After I had spent an uncomfortable duration listening to her weep, I finally spoke. "Listen, Mom, I don't want to discuss this right now. I'm occupied. When can we talk about it? Will there ever be an opportune moment to talk?" "Not really," I admitted with a sigh. "Work keeps me quite busy these days. I have my own life to lead." "I understand," she sniffled. "Listen, kiddo, I don't have much time left. Cancer is a harsh reality, and it's taking its toll on me physically. I require assistance with decluttering. My residence has become excessively occupied lately. Would you be willing to visit and help me remove some items from the house? I can no longer access the cellar." I paused. Why did she request my aid? Couldn't you engage some professional movers or similar services? "I could, but I desire to discuss matters with you. I am prepared to compensate you." I inwardly rolled my eyes at the suggestion. "How substantial is the payment? What do you say to $500? $500 was $500. That was income one could not afford to decline, especially given how dire my financial circumstances were proving to be, despite all the hours I was dedicating to my employment. "Very well, I will assist," I conceded. "When do you require my presence?" "Excellent. My sincere gratitude for your willingness to help." I could discern the relief evident in her voice. "Come by at your convenience whenever you have a day free. I do not wish for you to overexert yourself." We exchanged pleasantries and then I terminated the call. A few days elapsed, and I was driving towards a dwelling I had vowed never to set foot in again. Upon entering the driveway, I immediately sensed that something was amiss. The lawn's grass stood considerably taller than my knees, and the weeds scaling the exterior walls resembled veritable vines. Yellowed and tattered envelopes spilled from the mailbox. It appeared that one more piece of mail would have caused it to burst. It struck me as peculiar that the property had seemingly been neglected. If she was capable of contacting me, then surely she could have reached out to a neighbor or another individual who could offer her assistance with these matters, correct? I could not suppress a sense of guilt. Had it been a misjudgment to exclude her from my life while her health declined? I gathered as much of the mail as I could comfortably hold and navigated through the untamed front yard towards the entrance steps. The steps were an uneven, fractured arrangement, and I nearly fell when I stumbled on the second-to-last one. Fortunately, I managed to use the handrail to regain my equilibrium, but the mail scattered across the entire front porch area. I pressed the doorbell and commenced collecting the dispersed mail. Despite the considerable time it took to gather everything, no one answered the door. Unusual. I rang the doorbell once more. I waited several minutes, but there was still no response. My gaze drifted towards one of the windows, and I observed that the curtains were drawn. Based on my recollection, my mother had always been inclined to allow sunlight into the house, particularly during our thorough cleaning sessions on Sundays. So why were the curtains closed in the middle of the day? Assuming that perhaps she had lost track of time and fallen asleep, I set the mail down and dialed her telephone number. The persistent ringing echoed from the interior of the house. I listened to her phone ring repeatedly, but all my attempts to connect were in vain. Growing increasingly apprehensive, I knocked forcefully on the door and called out to her multiple times. Nothing. Recognizing that I was making no progress, I proceeded to the side of the house. Unlike the front window, the view through the side windows was not obstructed by draperies, but by a profusion of possessions. From my vantage point on the lawn, I could discern towering stacks of various items, ranging from boxes and newspapers to furniture from decades past and refuse. My heart ached at the sight. "Good heavens, Mother, what has become of you?" I murmured, stepping over the rusted chain-link fence into her backyard. I ascended the steps to the patio and was immediately overcome with a shiver by what I beheld. The rear door was ajar, open by a few inches. As I approached it, a horrendous stench assaulted my senses. I gagged audibly and pulled my shirt over my nose to shield myself from the noxious odor emanating from within. Gripping the door with one hand, I used the other to shove aside the mountain of debris obstructing my path. It required several attempts, but eventually, the entire pile toppled onto the floor. The opening had widened sufficiently for me to maneuver through. I wriggled my way inside, my body brushing against more clutter as I forced my entry. The squelching sound beneath my feet made it feel as though I were traversing a field of decaying pumpkins. I had to restrain my breathing. Even with my shirt serving as a makeshift mask, the smell was overpowering. Years of accumulated mold and spoiled food had transformed my childhood home into a place that bore more resemblance to a landfill than a residence. "Mother!" My voice echoed through the house, but there was still no indication that anyone was present. How could she possibly exist in such a state? The further I ventured into the house, the more perplexed I became. It was challenging enough to orient myself within the labyrinth of seemingly endless garbage, but the visual aspects were even more difficult to bear. In the living room, where my mother had on countless occasions expressed her displeasure with me for disrupting her life, stood pillars of assorted magazines and newspapers that reached the ceiling, akin to Jenga towers. In addition to moldy food and other detritus, fragments of broken glass from lamps that were no longer functional were scattered across the floor. What was most unsettling, however, was not the narrow pathways created by the clutter, nor even the several pounds of hamburger meat teeming with flies in the kitchen sink. It was the spider webs. They were pervasive. I detest spiders. Ever since I was a child, they have instilled terror in me. One of my earliest recollections involves finding a spider on the bathroom floor and requiring my mother to dispatch it with a newspaper. Consequently, when I observed the webs transforming from minuscule, membranous collections in corners to complete, thick tapestries draped over entire pieces of furniture, I nearly departed at that very moment. However, I could not abandon my mother to face such circumstances alone. "Hello, Mother. I am here." My voice, cracking slightly, was accompanied by the sound of something scurrying overhead. My attention was drawn upwards, and I saw spiders slowly moving amidst the cracks and exposed beams. Trembling, I moved from my position in the kitchen towards the staircase. Ascending the stairs was not the effortless task it had been during my youth. In fact, it proved exceedingly difficult. The slippery plastic bags and miscellaneous cardboard boxes that covered nearly every individual step made climbing the stairs feel like an ordeal from the netherworld. After several minutes of cautiously selecting my footing, I reached the top of the stairs. To my left stood the door to my mother's room. It appeared precisely as I remembered it, seemingly untouched by the passage of time or the pervasive filth. I grasped the doorknob and turned it slowly. I pushed the door open, its hinges creaking as it revealed a sight I had not anticipated. The room was tidy. It was not immaculate, but it was cleaner than the previous areas of the house I had encountered. However, that was not what captured my attention. On the far side of the room, seated in a recliner, was my mother, obscured by layers of dust. Her form was motionless in a reclining chair by the window. "Mother, what is happening?" I crossed the room towards her. The closer I approached, the more frail she appeared. When I nudged her, I expected her to awaken from a doze. But that was not what transpired. I wished that had been the case. Instead, her lifeless body turned to face me, and I nearly cried out. Her eyes were absent. The skin on her face was a discolored mosaic of tissue. Her phone rested in her lap. She was deceased. Oh, my goodness! I retreated, tears threatening to fall. Had I arrived any sooner, perhaps she would still be with us. The individual whom I had wished would suffer for her past treatment of me was no longer here. I could not retract my feelings, my words, or my actions. Not now and not ever. All I could do was sit on the bed and weep. I had spoken with her earlier that week. I swear I had. If I had not spoken with her, who would I have conversed with? "Jordan, where are you?" It was my mother's voice. "Excuse me." A chilling sensation coursed up my spine. My eyes flickered from my mother's body to the doorway. There was no conceivable way that the woman whose lifeless form I had seen with my own eyes had called out to me. "My dear, I cannot locate you. The house has become so crowded these days." I remained silent, holding my breath as I heard sounds emanating from somewhere downstairs. I pushed myself to a standing position and listened as the mattress springs settled behind me with a muted series of pops. Moving stealthily towards the door, I peered around but saw no one. "Jordan, respond to me this very instant." The voice had taken on an irritated tone. It was the voice I had long associated with my mother. Hearing it again filled me with a dread I had not experienced since childhood. I disregarded the command. Instead, I stood in the doorway and listened as the voice grew angrier and closer. "Do not force me to come up there." This time, the voice became more guttural. I covered my mouth to stifle any response. The sound of shifting debris and scuttling noises ascending the stairs filled the house. I retreated back into the bedroom, but the floor creaked beneath me, betraying my presence. "Jordan, I know precisely where you are." With a nightmarish cadence, its abdomen swayed as it advanced up the stairs. "It has been such a long time since I have seen my boy." Paralyzed, I was unable to move. I could only stare at the clusters of beady, animalistic eyes that reflected back at me. Beneath them was a visage I recognized all too well. It was my mother. Her cheeks sagged and stretched around fangs that clicked together, glistening with saliva. Segmented legs sprawled from beneath, twitching at the slightest disturbance of the chitinous shell that trailed behind it. "Come give me a kiss." The entity, claiming to be my mother, clacked its fangs and moved towards me with deliberate patience. I recoiled and shook my head, refusing to yield to this creature's demands. "Go to perdition," I declared, rushing towards the staircase railing and vaulting over. The cardboard boxes below cushioned my landing as a wailing, chittering shriek reverberated from above. With an unsettling fluidity, the monstrous silhouette descended the stairs. I barreled through the accumulated garbage on the stairs, frantically scrambling back the way I had come. "You get back here right now, Jordan." I did not look back. I continued pushing forward through all the clutter. The house became more suffocating with every step I took. Piles of trash ensnared my shoes and made it disorienting to determine my location. "Jordan." My heart pounded against my rib cage as I burst into the kitchen and felt my feet become immediately stuck. I had failed to realize that the surrounding area was engulfed in overlapping layers of webs, from wall to wall, cabinet to cabinet, even the floor. The room had become a trap. I jerked and wriggled, but my movements were futile. Elastic and silky webbing clung to my hands like adhesive. Hysterically, I continued to attempt to free myself, but the more I struggled, the more tenacious it became. Excuse me, a brief aside here, everyone. It is exceedingly unfortunate to be terrified of spiders in this predicament. Why couldn't the original poster have been, say, afraid of heights or snakes or taxes? Anyway, let us continue. Above me, I heard it scurry before dropping into view from the ceiling. With a thud, it flexed its legs and propelled itself towards me. My mother's face was entirely consumed by a ravenous intent. Got you. The web enclosure vibrated with every restricted movement I made. I kicked to keep it at bay, but a moment later it lunged. I jerked my head away as its fangs snapped inches from my face. The impact sent me to the floor, and I felt my body sink deeper into the lattice of webbing around me. Panic coursed through me as I struggled, but the silk clung to my clothes and skin, pulled me down like a fish being reeled in. The creature adjusted its position and gazed down at me with longing and hunger. Jordan, Mother has missed you dearly. The voice rumbled through the silk. The fangs lowered themselves towards me with an eager precision, but before they could make contact, I used my remaining strength to lift my hands and shield my face. They sliced through the webbing, allowing me to free my hands. I kicked and pushed the creature away from me. My newfound freedom enabled me to grasp a nearby piece of glass from the door. Turning to face it once more, I stabbed it into its closest eye. With a horrific shriek of pain, it darted towards the wall and retreated upwards along it. Jordan, how dare you treat your mother this way, you unappreciative brat. My legs burned with adrenaline as I struggled against the sticky webbing and hurried towards the back door. It was still ajar from earlier, but I would have to force my way through the same debris. Without even bothering to look back, I threw myself into the gap, shoulder first, and powered my way through. I moved as swiftly as I could, scraping my skin against the piles and tearing away the last strands of webbing clinging to my body. Sunlight peeked through on the other side like a beacon of hope. But before I could reach it, something gripped my shoe. I turned to see my mother holding on tightly with her fangs, desperate to drag me back into the house. Let go, I pleaded as I kicked repeatedly. My foot squished with every blow that struck an eye or some part of her. A resounding crack filled the air as my foot connected with a thong. Get back here, she screamed. I stumbled out onto the back steps and ran faster than I ever have in my entire life towards the fence. After scaling it, I bolted towards my car, hopped into the driver's side, and floored it out of the neighborhood. I never returned. I am uncertain how long I drove for, but when the adrenaline had subsided, I pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store and dialed 911. The police were initially hesitant to investigate, but they eventually relented. They discovered my mother's body amidst the webs, but they never found the monster wearing my mother's countenance. That is something I do not care to contemplate for extended periods. What I do contemplate is the moment I opened that door and saw my lifeless mother seated in that chair. I do not know how long she remained there, nor the extent of her suffering. All I know is that she perished alone, and I was not present. I cannot alter that fact. People now discuss her as if she were nothing more than a hoarder, but I do not envision the house when I think of her. I simply recall my mother. Everlack death mask. That was something else. That was truly excellent. I am contemplating now that perhaps I should include a trigger warning for arachnophobia at the commencement of this video. In any event, if you all have made it this far into the video, thank you immensely for watching, and do not forget to like and subscribe as it genuinely assists me. A significant commendation to my channel members. Thank you profoundly for your support of the channel. If you wish to further support the channel, that link is provided in the description. However, it is not at all obligatory, entirely optional. With all that has been stated, I will see you tomorrow. Peace.